In this lesson, we're going to learn how to get a good stereoscopic setting in our scene by applying some of the guidelines that we learned in the previous lesson. So let's pop back into Houdini where we left off and set up the stereo effect for this shot. Now, we'll need to go ahead and tweak the settings on the stereo cam rig, so go to it, access the stereo tab, and the two most important settings are the zero parallax setting and the interaxial distance. If you've been working from the past couple of lessons, make sure show interaxial control and show ZPS markers turned on because it'll help us visualize where we want these values to be at. Now, the first one we'll change is the interaxial distance, which defines the interaxial separation or the distance between the left and the right cameras. As mentioned in the previous lesson, you want to make sure the interaxial separation is not greater than the distance between the average pupils or the two eyes on an average human being. You want to make sure it doesn't go beyond that, which is 65 millimeters to a range of 75 millimeters. Now keep in mind, if you were to go to the interaxial distance and set it to something like maybe 70 millimeters, for example, you're not going to get the right value. The cameras have been extended really far away, and that's because this value needs to be expressed in meters and not in millimeters. So you want to take your millimeter value and divide that by 1,000 to get it into a meters unit range. So something like this will be a more appropriate value. You can left click on the interaxial distance to look at the expression results, which happens to be 0.07, and you can control shift left click after you create the expression to remove it to just work with this default or with this particular set value. So 0.07 is going to be my interaxial distance that I'm going to work with, which interestingly enough is really close to the default of 0.075. You want to make sure your interaxial distance does not go too high above this particular value. So I'm going to go ahead and take it back to what I set, which was 0.07, which is basically 70 millimeters. You want to keep it at that range. Now with that, the next setting we need to tweak is the zero parallax setting, and you can do a lot of these value settings without looking through your 3D glasses. Try not to work with it too much while changing these settings because you may end up getting a little bit of a headache while trying to get these values right. It's a good idea to use these guidelines to get these parameter results, and then you can tweak them thereafter in preview occasionally by popping your glasses on or off. Now, we want to talk about the zero parallax setting, but even before we talk about what value we want this to be, take your slider and take it from 0 to the final value, which happens to be 10. Notice that this does not come anywhere close to where our scene is set up at. So at a value of 10, which is what my maximum slider value is set to here, it's not getting to where we need it to be. You can take this value and set it to a greater number like 100 or so, which gets it closer to where we need it to be, but this brings about a very important factor you want to take into account when setting up your stereo shots. How big is your scene with relation to what's looking at it, or basically the viewer? Right now, we're not dealing with a landscape shot, we're dealing with a human-sized scientist tipping a beaker over. So it's a fairly average sized scene. It's not a very small microscopic scene, it's not a ginormous landscape. So we want to take that factor into account, and if you're dealing with a human character, it's actually there's a very good metric to work with, which is the distance between the eyes on that character. You want to make sure that that distance between the eyes is pretty close or somewhat matches the distance between the two camera eye focus points over here. Right now they're nowhere close to each other, which means that this scene is really big and we want to adjust the values accordingly. We either need to ratchet the values of the interaxial distance and the zero parallax settings or reduce the size of the scene. In this case, since I'm dealing with basic meshes, I can reduce the scene size here or the scene scale to accommodate my 75 millimeter or 70 millimeter interaxial distance. So let's do that. Let's go to our scene here, open the net box. All of the scene elements are children of a scene null, and we can reduce the scene null by shrinking it with a uniform scale. So let's take the uniform scale and reduce it maybe from 1 to 0.1, and let's see what that gets us. Alright, the scene's much smaller now. Let's go ahead and look through the stereo camera rig and just maybe home in on the scene object here. So press space G to frame selected. Let's pull back here, focus in like so, and there we go. I'm going to pull out now to my native camera, and let's examine the distance between the camera and the eyes. You can simply look at it and tell that the eyes are still way farther apart than my default interaxial separation here. So we may need to take this down another notch. Take the uniform scale from 0.1 to 0.01. The thing to keep in mind is that this scene was an FBX file imported in, and it was imported in at a much bigger scale than what it would normally be. So always keep that in mind. Make sure your scene is scaled properly based on the character or whatever scene or whatever objects you're using. That happened to be too big. Now we're just shrinking it down, and now let's focus through the stereo rig and see what we get. I'm going to once again frame the objects and pull in and out. Now at this point, our clipping values might be a little bit too small. That's why the geometry is getting clipped here. No problems. Go to your stereo cam rig, go to the view tab, and just reduce the clipping plane, the near clipping, to maybe something like 0.1. Let's take it even smaller, 0.01. I'll pull this in here, like so. Alright, let's frame this up. And now we have something that's probably a little bit more suited, because if I were to go in here and look through my viewport camera again, you can see that the distance between our camera, the left and right eye, is pretty close to that of our scientist character over here. So that'll do the trick for us for now. I'm going to go ahead and collapse my scene netbox back. And now let's try and work with these values. So let's go back to our stereo tab for the stereo camera and look through it. And now let's start working with these settings. Right now the zero parallax is way too big. So let's go ahead, drag on the slider. It'll snap back to the range of 0 to 10. And let's set that up accordingly. What's a good setting for the zero parallax settings? Well, you can always move this around and eyeball it till you get a decent setting. But a good guideline is to make sure that the closest object is not too close to the camera. So if you want to examine this, move on over to another camera view. I'll just go back to my viewport camera and take the zero parallax plane and start working with it. If you draw a line between the camera and the zero parallax setting plane over here, you want to make sure that the closest object, which in this case is the beaker, is not too far into the camera or not too past that midpoint. So right now, a zero parallax of maybe 3 over here would be too far out. You want to bring this and make it closer. Maybe something like this would do the trick. So in this case, if I set my zero parallax setting to 1.78 or maybe something like 2, this is a good value to work with because the beaker is not too close to the midpoint, or it's just right at that midpoint. It's not too close into the camera, and that's a good setting to work with. I might actually take it down a little bit more, and I think 1.78 is actually a good value to work with. So I'll just set it to 1.8 to round it out. Something like so. The beaker is not too close to the camera, and you don't want your objects to be too close to the camera because then the viewer will have to converge or really focus on that object that's right up in their face. So those are some good values to work with, starting points, and now we can look to the camera and then pop on our 3D glasses and start previewing with that particular result. So let's look at it, and that looks pretty good so far. And we can maybe take our zero parallax and maybe pull it maybe forward a little bit, like so. And these values are pretty good to work with actually. 1.73 and so on. So that's actually a pretty good range. The 1.73 value might be good. Let me pull out my 3D glasses. Something else that's a good indicator of how this is going to be is look at the amount of overlap that occurs. Where you want the area of no depth to be is where the overlap is the maximum. So right now the overlap is maximum at the elbows over here, which is great because the hands are sticking out and the beaker and the liquid is really sticking out of the viewing plane. So this is a good value to work with. I'll maybe set this to maybe 1.75. Let me look through it through my 3D glasses one more time. And that looks like a very nice setting. The arms are sticking out a little bit, the beaker is sticking out, and that looks pretty good. So I think we have satisfactory values to work with here. So we'll take a break now, and in the next lesson, we'll go ahead and see how we can set this up for rendering.